This week on Christian World News, conflict in America's capital. The fight over a Supreme Court nominee turns ugly while Christians pray for peace. Plus, in Indonesia, an earthquake followed by a tsunami. More than 1,000 are dead. We'll talk with relief agencies on the ground fighting to bring aid to the victims. And a mystery solved. How an ancient manuscript that went missing turned up at the Museum of the Bible. Welcome to Christian World News, everyone. I'm Wendy Griffith. George Thomas is on assignment. In America's capital, the fight over Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh has brought out the worst in our politics. Swing senators like Susan Collins required a police escort to protect them from being heckled by protesters as well as the media. Protesters have also taken over senators' offices and sent rude and often harassing messages to staff members. It's become so bad, Senator Rand Paul's wife wrote an open letter calling for civility. She says it's hard for her to watch and hear stories of senators and their spouses being harassed in public, like Ted Cruz and his wife Heidi.
Those people were up in their face, waving their middle fingers and just jabbing their fingers in their face and saying horrible things to them. It's really aggressive, it's violent, it's an assault. That is the opposite of making your views known.
But in the midst of this chaos, groups are coming to the Capitol to pray. Intercessor Dutch Sheets came to Washington with a team of prayer warriors to plead for God's mercy.
I don't think we have to pray perfectly. I just think we have to pray. And if we show up, God will do the rest.
Amen. Well, CBN's Abigail Robertson joins us now from the United States Capitol. And Abigail, wow, what an incredible morning. Talk to us, if you can, about the division, the tension that you're witnessing being there on the ground between both parties. Has it ever been this bad?
Well, I can only speak for the 2 years that I've been covering the Capitol, but no, I have never seen it this bad. The emotions you're seeing from the senators are very real. What you saw, the anger you saw from Lindsey Graham last week was very real. I think there are many Republican senators who are genuinely concerned that no matter what happens with the Supreme Court, Judge Kavanaugh's life has been marked and tainted by this forever, and they feel like the Supreme Court, they just feel like the Senate has completely mishandled this whole process to a point that is very damaging, not only for Judge Kavanaugh, but also for Dr. Ford long after this process is over. And I think many senators really want to see a return to regular order, and they fear that future nominees will not accept, and people will not want to fill these positions because of the way that their personal lives and their families are dragged through the mud.
Abby, what are you hearing from Christian senators? There are many believers on both sides of the aisle. What are they saying that needs to happen and needs to be done right now?
Yes, there are many lawmakers that are Christians, and they're definitely praying throughout this process. I ran into Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, a couple days ago, and he actually is a big part of a bipartisan Christian Senate Bible study that meets every Wednesday. And I just asked him, what are you praying throughout this process? And he told me every day he prays for the president, he prays for the Senate, and right now he's asking God for wisdom and humility. And I just saw him an hour ago, and he just talked about this process and said that there are things we can and should do to make sure the next confirmation process has a clearer and fairer process. So I think both sides are just upset with how this whole thing has been handled and what we're seeing play out right now.
Yeah, we just saw a soundbite with Dutch Sheets. He's on the ground there. What other prayer ministries are you witnessing there? What are they hoping to accomplish?
Yeah, well, this is something, we haven't seen at all in the media. But while there are so many protesters, you can probably hear them behind me right now, there are also a lot of prayer groups that I've seen this week during the first original hearing and last week. And they're just praying that God's will be done in this situation. And they're just trying to bring peace here in the Capitol and just counter some of just the anger that we're seeing up here right now.
Abigail Robertson, reporting for us from the Capitol. You're doing great work. Thanks so much, Abigail. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Turning across the globe to Indonesia, the death toll from an earthquake and tsunami disaster is more than 1,500 and still climbing, with some 200,000 people needing urgent help. CBN Operation Blessing teams in Indonesia are among the first to bring help. Lucille Toulousan brings us the story.
There is a growing desperation among survivors of the massive 7.5 earthquake and the tsunami that followed. More than 70,000 are displaced and living in tents, their homes flattened and destroyed. The wait for help has led to looting and chaos. Clean water, food, and medical help, among others, are badly needed. Despite difficulties in logistics, Indonesia's Operation Blessing managed to bring aid to survivors in Palu. They brought in boxes of food, medicine, and gave medical help to the sick and injured. This mother is relieved that an Operation Blessing doctor can dress the stitched forehead of her son before it gets infected. This lady's wounded leg is finally being treated after she sprained it while running from falling debris. The team also reached Sigi Biromaru district, where the quake leveled a church, killing more than 30 youngsters having Bible study. There are still many worse-hit areas isolated due to damaged roads and landslides. Operation Blessing teams are pushing to reach more survivors in these areas in the coming weeks and bring them much-needed help, and to let them know that there are people who care about them. Lucille Toulousan, CBN News.
Lucille, always in the middle of it. We appreciate her reporting. Well, the Christian relief agency World Vision is also on the ground. We spoke with the ministry's Tim Costello on the island of Palau about efforts to reach the victims and the impact the help is making.
The roads out into remote areas are cracked. They run out of gas supplies. Just now, we're starting to get relief supplies through. We've been distributing beds and tarpaulins, water systems, family hygiene kits. Look, the most important thing for World Vision is to recognise that in reaching out and caring, we are saying you're not abandoned by God. God, who has shown us his love in Jesus, is here. The truth is that people who are hungry and desperate, when they see something that is more than just practical help, and that's what we're doing, but a spiritual help, a sense that the world hasn't spun out of control, that God is still on the throne, that we have hope and confidence. This is ministry.
This is ministry. Amen. Well, up next, the mystery surrounding an ancient biblical manuscript. And welcome back. Well, there's renewed hope. Turkey will release Pastor Andrew Brunson at his next hearing on October 12th. Brunson is currently under house arrest after spending almost 2 years in a Turkish prison, accused of crimes related to his Christian faith. His daughter spoke at the Values Voter Summit in Washington and says it's been difficult for her dad and their family.
I'll say there are times when I'm not necessarily happy with God's plan in this situation, but I've really come to realize that God is in complete control and he has a plan, and this is all for his glory. He is worth everything that my family has gone through, and I've seen that message coming through in letters from my dad as well, as he has started to transform and really submit to God and say, God, my life is yours. Whatever you do with me, let it honor you, let it declare your name and your goodness to people. And I am
Wow. Well, the Trump administration has been putting diplomatic and economic pressure on Turkey to release Pastor Brunson. In Romania, churches are standing up to the LGBT agenda. We spoke with Pastor Tudor Patan of Alpha Omega TV about a constitutional referendum to protect biblical marriage.
We want to have a small change in the constitution of Romania. Until now, the constitution defined the family as a free will marriage between spouses, and we want to have a small change that the marriage is a union between a man and a woman. This is a small change, but with big significance. Looking in the future, already it's a big pressure over our kids in our schools to introduce LGBT agenda, education, gender ideology. So we want to preserve and to avoid future involvement of LGBT in our nation. And in fact, we want to be the same side with God in our nation.
Romania voters will decide the issue in coming days. Well, in Canada, an historic event as more than 300 Christian pastors say no to SOGI. SOGI is the sexual orientation, gender identification curriculum being taught in Canada's public schools. Christian leaders say it's harming children and teaching unbiblical views on sexuality. The pastors recently came out against it by signing the West Coast Christian Accord.
We will not remain silent as children are brainwashed to reject heterosexuality and embrace gender fluidity, homosexuality, bisexuality, and other forms of sexual behaviors.
We are opposed to students being taught lifestyles that the Bible calls sin.
Pastors say SOGI confuses young children by forcing them to choose a gender when they already have one. The pastors are asking the BC Minister of Education to stop use of all SOGI-related resources in public schools. Well, our next story might sound like something ripped from the pages of an international mystery thriller. An ancient biblical manuscript was recently discovered at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, a manuscript that had been missing for years. From Greece, Ben Kennedy brings us the story.
The mystery began when the University of Athens discovered their 10th-century-old manuscript had been stolen. Then it turns up across the Atlantic right here in D.C.
The manuscript is right here in the front.
And the big question remains, how did this 1,000-year-old document become a display at the Museum of the Bible? Problem solved. We know where it's at. How did it leave the University of Athens?
Well, this is the mystery.
Okay, so it continues.
Yeah, it continues.
The manuscript dates back to the 1100s when a monk copied the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Odds are the book was used at a Greek Orthodox church or monastery. Fast forward some 800 years when it was donated to the University of Athens and then went missing sometime in 1991.
They had put this manuscript on display beginning in 1987 at a sort of an anniversary of the founding of the university, and they loaned it to the University Museum from the University Library, along with 3 other manuscripts. 4 years later, they got a note from the museum registrars that, well, we have 3 of your manuscripts and we're just letting you know. They didn't say anything about the 4th manuscript not being there.
From that point, the relic was basically MIA.
The word is stolen, right? It was taken without permission. Somebody stole it. It's pretty easy to slip something like this into a briefcase or a bag. There's no, detector tracking system on it, so it's unfortunately easy to remove.
Documents reveal it first resurfaced at an auction in 1998. Then it passed through a handful of private collectors before being donated to the Museum of the Bible in 2014. No one knew the truth because of tampering and a missing page.
That page may have had some identifying marks, so it looks like someone intentionally tried to hide the identity of the manuscript.
Meanwhile, the University of Athens did some digging and discovered its missing property could be in America.
One of our scholars associated with us, Dr. Tommy Wasserman, had posted information about the manuscript on a New Testament database, and that's where the university found the information and thought, well, this looks kind of similar to ours, and let's talk about this.
That talk led to a breakthrough. And now the newly found document has been returned home.
These are the inheritance of all of humanity, right? The history of the Bible and how it's been preserved.
And for being more than 1,000 years old, it's in pretty good shape.
Yes, it's parchment, which as long as it's properly cared for, will be preserved for a very long time.
Now the manuscript was packed up and shipped back to Greece on October 1st. And as you can imagine, the university was tracking it closely as it made its way home. Before it returned to the rightful owner, the rare manuscript was on display at the Museum of the Bible, where thousands got to learn the story and see this piece of biblical history firsthand. As for who took it, well, that part remains a mystery, one that scholars hope to solve soon. Ben Kennedy, CBN News, Washington.
The Mystery continues. Well, coming up, the church that's known for its inspiring praise and worship is now starting its own denomination. We'll talk with Hillsong's pastor about the church's future and its new mission. Welcome back to Christian World News. Well, if your church sings worship music, chances are there are a few tunes from Hillsong on the congregation's weekly list. The Australian church has provided the soundtrack for churches around the world for many, many years. Last week, church leadership announced plans to form its own denomination, pulling away from Australia's largest Pentecostal denomination. Pastor Brian Houston says with Hillsong's growth around the world, it needs to be able to credential its own pastors and structure the church in a way crucial to the progress of its mission. CBN's Ephraim Graham sat down with Houston in Studio 5 to talk about the ups and downs of living, loving, and leading.
More than 20,000 people attend services at Hillsong Church on any given Sunday, with campuses in Sydney, Kiev, Moscow, New York City, London, Cape Town, Paris, and so many more. And leading the worldwide flock is global pastor Brian Houston, who shares some of the journey in his book, Live, Love, Lead. Why this book? What made you want to write this book?
Well, I think the book's been in my heart for a long time. I have been pastoring for 32 years, same church, 40 years preaching and ministering, and I just felt like there was a lot in me I wanted to use to help other people, equip other people. So the timing right now just seemed to be the right time. I had the time to actually write the book, and so Live, Love, Lead, that's where I am.
Houston and his wife Bobby first started Hillsong in 1983, meeting in a school hall and then a warehouse with only 45 members. It grew to 900 people in 4 years and continues to multiply. This church isn't the church you started 40 years ago.
That's for sure. No, we started in a little school hall in the outer suburbs of Sydney. In those days, it was like green fields where we were, and we were in a small hall, as I say, and it is an amazing story. I mean, it's a miracle.
Did you envision this? I remember reading, and you and your wife dating in a car that backs down into someone's house, essentially, because you forget to put it in park. Is this what you guys talked about all those years ago?
We really could not have imagined all that God has done. We both, my wife and I, both grew up in New Zealand. The story you're talking about in the book is our neighbour who used to go to the tiny little Assemblies of God church we went to, had a very steep drive, and so we were parked at the top of their drive and just talking about the future and planning, and yeah, you got to read the book to see the rest. But I've got to tell you that we did have in our heart to serve God and to believe to do something significant, but the grace of God has been something we could never have perceived.
What's been the toughest part of those 40 years for you?
Well, I talk in the book about the worst day of my life. I was 45, it was in 1999. My father was my absolute hero. In fact, he was one of my great inspirations in terms of what I do today. And at 45, one of the guys who works for me came into my office, and we went through our normal list of things to talk about. And at the end, he said, there's just one more thing. And so the way he said it, the tone, I knew something was wrong. And he told me that we'd had a complaint come in that many years before that, probably in the 1970s, that my father had abused a young man. So, yeah, I mean, you couldn't hit me with worse news. It sort of hit me in layers. And so I had to confront my own father and ask him about that. So that definitely is the worst day of my life.
How did that resolve itself? I can't even imagine navigating that.
I don't know whether it has resolved itself as such. My father now has been dead for over 10 years, but the ramifications of that are still playing out right now.
What lessons did God allow that to teach you?
You know, one thing I do know is it wasn't me. I didn't do anything wrong. It was my father. And, you know, in the world we live, there's some people would love to try and frame me by my father's sin. But I refused to let that happen. But I guess it helped me to realise that, everyone has their issues, has their battle, whatever that is, and that's why I think everyone is a perfect recipient for the gospel of Jesus, the grace of God.
Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders.
And with more than 40 recordings to their credit, music is a Hillsong signature. Their contemporary Christian praise songs are the Sunday soundtrack for churches around the world.
When many people think of Hillsong before they even think of the church and your ministry now, the music is so far-reaching. What do you think? I mean, are you a musician? What do you?
I was the church drummer when I was a teenager, but compared with the people today, no, I'm not a musician. But I always had a heart to pastor the kind of church that was an inspiration to churches. I'm a great believer in the potential of the church, and I mean the local church. And so I always kind of wanted to have a church where we wrote and sung songs that helped the church. And so it's an amazing thing because been through various personalities over all these years, but really from the start, it seems the songs from our church struck a chord with people, firstly in Australia, obviously, and then globally. And it's been a miracle story. Someone once said to me, Brian, you realise this is only a season. They're talking about the impact of the worship from Hillsong. And I agree, it's only a season, but so far it's been a very long season.
Finally this week, First Lady Melania Trump made her first international trip without the president, visiting African nations including Ghana, Malawi, Kenya, and Egypt. Mrs. Trump landed in Ghana for the first stop of her week-long visit. Part of the goal of her trip is to promote her Be Best initiative around the world, and it was her first time to Africa. Good for her. Well, thanks for joining us this week. From all of us here at Christian World News, until next week, goodbye. And as always, God bless you.